All right, welcome back. It is the Vegas Take, and God, I love that band Pearl Jam. You know, coming out of Seattle, and we had this horrible story last night in Seattle. I believe 7 people injured, 1 person killed, and another shooting. You know, gun violence. It's a big issue throughout the country, throughout the world, really, but it's certainly up in the United States, certainly in Chicago. A lot, but you know, listen. You know, I'm the first person to always blame the person who pulls the trigger. I talk about gun responsibility all the time. I think there's a lot of things we need to do as a nation to bring people together and to try to figure out why we're having these mass shootings. Why is there so much gun violence? And a great person to talk about this is Dan Reid. Dan Reid is the Western Director of the National Rifle Association. I know he's in town, and he joins us right now on the line. SHOT Show in town as well, bringing a variety of outdoor enthusiasts to Las Vegas. Dan, I really do appreciate your time. I appreciate you coming on. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So a lot to get to in a short period of time. What do you think is
problem?
What do you think is the biggest misconception from people like myself that say on the air every day that we need stronger background checks? We need red flag laws. We need to get some of these assault weapons off the streets. What do you think is the biggest misconception that maybe frustrates you?
You know, when it comes to firearms and firearm laws, I'm a native Californian. Actually, I do work throughout the West, and people point to California. That's a state that gun control supporters really look to as the example of laws. And California has more than 800 firearm laws on the books. It ranges all across the board on different topics. It transcends the penal code, the vehicle code, you name it. And not only is there a whole set of statutes that gun owners have to comply with, but there's also an entire regulatory body. It's completely overwhelming and confusing. And a couple of years ago, there was an initiative that passed there along with some legislation requiring background checks on ammunition. I don't know if you've been following this story at all, but that went into effect this past July, on July 1st. And what has been happening with that is law-abiding gun owners have been being denied the ability to purchase ammunition because it's so burdensome and the system is so broken. So in a short time, we actually have some litigation that we're supporting on this. There was 360,000, 370,000 checks over about a 3 or 4 month period. And of those, there was over 60,000 denials. And of those 60,000 denials, only 100 or just over 100 people were actually prohibited possessors. So the other 59,000 plus were actually law-abiding citizens, and they're being denied their constitutional right based on clerical errors or a mismatch in information that's in the system.
Dan, I'm on your side.
And that's what we see. What we see with a lot of these laws is we're not actually going after the criminal misuse of firearms, but we're putting more restrictions on law-abiding citizens. They're trying to make it more difficult, more costly, more burdensome. In fact, there's a bill up in California today to put an excise tax on firearm purchases along with an unspecified percentage on ammunition purchases, and that goes in addition to the already $60+ $70 that it takes to purchase a firearm for a first-time firearm purchaser in the state of California before you ever factor in the cost of the gun. So we're really seeing the onus is on the law-abiding while they're ignoring that criminal element and not going after those guys.
All right, that's fair enough. And listen, let me make no mistake about it. I'm on your side where if you're a responsible person, you've never committed a felony, there are no mental issues going on in your head, and that's something we'll get to in a second. I am all for everybody being able to protect themselves. I think the issues that I have are the type of weapons that are being sold, doing a better job in detecting mental illness, and red flag laws. Let's start with red flag laws, Dan, if that's okay. I look at the Parkland shooter. And I think the police were called to his house 48 times. He shouldn't have been allowed to buy a gun. So let me ask you this question. God forbid, right, if let's just say, I don't know, somebody in your family's working, your wife or whoever, God forbid, I'm just putting a hypothetical out there, and somebody at her work threatens her life, not just through words face-to-face or hearsay, but through a text message. You have the proof. You call police. Maybe that person or persons are arrested. Are you okay with them getting out of jail within 24 hours and legally purchasing a gun in that specific situation?
So I think that with the hypothetical, there are criminal type statutes as far as, terroristic threats, et cetera, that could be utilized. But see, the problem with red flag laws is we're not taking away a person's rights based on a criminal conviction or a mental adjudication, but it's based on third-party allegations. And our biggest problem when it comes to red flag laws is the lack of due process, because they can be done in an ex parte order. So a person may have no knowledge that this is going on, and then law enforcement's going to show up at their house and confiscate their firearms, and they're going to have a hearing several weeks later. In some respects, it almost works contrary to some of the policies that we're pushing with law enforcement as far as de-escalation, because this could actually be an escalating situation when law enforcement shows up unannounced at your house. And it's not just a single officer. Generally, these calls go out, and it's a mentally disturbed person that's armed, and so you're going to have a significant law enforcement presence, and that has, in some situations, there was a case out of Maryland where that did turn deadly for the person receiving the order. But really, the focus on this is the lack of due process on the front end, is that guilty until proven innocent feature, and so we're seeing expansions. I mentioned California earlier on the red flag law. They were one of the early states to implement red flag laws a few years back, and they've continued to grow that program. So originally, the reporters were family members and law enforcement, and now that's grown. Just this past year, they signed it. So now you have coworkers, you have school employees, et cetera. They could go and pursue these orders. As well as they've extended the duration that they can be in place for up to 5 years.
No, I get it.
Which is a long time for someone that hasn't ever been convicted of a crime or adjudicated mentally ill.
Yeah.
And one of the other issues is we say you are so dangerous with these red flag laws that you cannot own or possess a firearm. But then we do no follow-up. We don't address any other element of dangerousness this person possesses. So we say you're so dangerous that you can't have a gun, but have a nice day. We don't do a mental health evaluation.
Well, that's a problem. That's a problem.
Yeah, and when you look at what we have on the books here in Nevada, we have a Legal 2000. And so if someone is going through a mental health crisis, law enforcement, before the red flag law was passed, has the ability to go and pursue a Legal 2000, actually get a mental health evaluation,
I'm with you.
To make sure
listen, Dan, I'm sorry. I'm with you on that, okay? But and I think we agree on most of this stuff.
Sure.
I think here's where we disagree. You're talking about due process. Okay. You're talking about you feel like it's guilty until proven innocent. Okay. You would have to agree with me. This is a case-by-case basis, and if you have a husband that is leaving voicemails or text message his wife that he's going to kill her when he gets home, I don't think that wife or her family wants to hear about due process. I think at the very least we need to put some laws in place so when that husband gets out of jail within 24 hours, and that's probably what it would be if you threaten somebody's life, he should not be allowed to carry a gun under any circumstances until he gets a psych evaluation. And again, every case is different. I agree with you. Give this guy a mental evaluation. But I'm sorry, Dan, I am not comfortable with a man or a woman who threatens their spouse and their life, and there's evidence to prove it, them getting out of jail within 24 hours and purchasing a gun and talking about due process. I am not personally comfortable with that.
And I, as I mentioned, there are laws on the books to deal with terroristic threats that you could go after someone and go after and suspend their rights or take away their rights because
it's not going to happen overnight, though.
When you're making
it's not going to happen
type threats.
But it's not going to happen within 24 hours. It's not going to happen immediately. When that guy or gets out of jail, he can purchase a gun. I think Republicans and Democrats need to work together. I hear you and I agree with you. In some instances, it's not fair, and there needs to be due process. But I think there are extenuating circumstances. And again, I think it's a difficult, slippery slope. I get that, but I think it's a case-by-case basis. I just wish Republicans and Democrats can work together. That's all.
Well, and you know, it's funny you bring that up. So if you look at how the red flag laws were passed in the state of Nevada, there was a standalone bill on red flag laws, but that bill actually died, failed to meet the deadlines. And so the way the red flag law was brought up in Nevada is there was an omnibus bill, and there was a single hearing on it earlier in the session. Red flags was not a part of that bill. And then later on in the session, red flags was inserted, but the language and the actual legislation was not made available to the public until minutes before the hearing.
That's
so
absurd.
A hearing got scheduled on this, and so now we have a brand new concept that gets introduced. And I don't know if you had an opportunity to watch this hearing, but you saw the proponents of the bill presenting the bill. You saw lawmakers up behind the dais there who were looking at a piece of legislation for the very first time, and the proponents were saying, well, on page 2, line 4, and there was confusion on who had the right version and the wrong version in this hearing. And so in our citizen legislature, we need transparency, especially with a significant change to our laws such as this that deals with due process issues.
Yeah, I agree.
And Fourth Amendment issues, et cetera. I mean, it touches a lot of different areas.
Mm-hmm.
We should have had full hearings. There should have been ample time for people to evaluate this bill and look at the different issues that may have been presented, rather than keeping this in the dark, inserting it at the last minute, passing it through, and jamming it all the way to the governor's office. That's not a good way to make policy in the state. And so, you talked about where can there be bipartisanship? Where can people that support these orders and not support these orders come together? Well, it's very difficult to have a good conversation when the language and the bills are being hidden.
I agree with you there. And listen, you used the term transparency. I could not agree with you more, but I want transparency across the board. Your director of the NRA has had many closed-door meetings with the President of the United States. Boy, I would have loved those conversations to have been public. I agree with you. I want transparency across the board. Let's talk a little bit about responsibility. I think we're going to agree on this one. Let's go back to the horrific Connecticut shooting where all those young kids lost their lives at the hands of a nut, okay? Now, that mother who lost her life, okay, she was a gun owner. She purchased those guns legally. Her son was mentally deranged. I think we can all agree on that. She not only taught her son, who couldn't even have a conversation with someone, she taught her son how to shoot a gun. And her son had access to guns in her house. That is the opposite of responsibility. I think we'll agree on that. We need to talk about this because if you're a parent and you're giving your kid who you know is mentally ill access to guns, those parents should go to jail. Sadly, it cost her life. But I think this needs to be talked about more in society, whereas just because you're a responsible gun owner, doesn't necessarily mean you're doing the right things in the home. Would you agree on that, Dan?
I think that people need to take responsibilities, and you can't legislate morality. And obviously, we talked about criminal elements and
right.
Various things early on, and personal responsibility. And there's things that people should take in appropriate steps. Unfortunately, in that situation, as you mentioned, he was mentally deranged and he murdered his mother. There was reality was obscured in that, and it was just a horrific tragedy. And, everyone's heart broke across the nation for that, for the families, for everyone. That was a horrible situation.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you this, and this might be a loaded question. Why is it that Republicans and Democrats cannot work together? Why is it that all these mass shootings listen, this didn't happen, Dan, when you and I were in high school. We didn't have all these school shootings. Number one, why are they happening now? What do you think is the reason for that? And number two, besides, some small bills moving forward, why is it that Republicans and Democrats can't work together and put together some things that most American people would support, like red flag laws, like background checks?
So NRA, we're nonpartisan. We're a single issue organization, and our focus is on our Second Amendment rights. And I think that, like a lot of things in this country right now, it's become incredibly polarized. And you probably see this all the time. People read headlines and they don't really dive in, and where a lot of things get troublesome with certain policies is in the details, right? So
Mm-hmm.
Going back to the red flag laws that were passed here in Nevada, there was just no transparency. There wasn't a good opportunity for people to come together and have a conversation on what that looks like, right?
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, I've mentioned our significant issues when it comes to red flag laws as far as due process, lack of mental health follow-up, et cetera. And that kind of goes along the lines of background checks too, right? For a lot of people, that sounds like a good idea, but
Yep.
in reality, there's significant problems with the actual public safety benefits of expanding background checks to private party transfers, right? So if you look at the background check law here, that was question 1 back in 2016, and that was passed through the legislature, again, single hearing, jammed through this past legislative session. That type of law, while it may sound good, the actual benefits of it are minimal. In fact, there was a study out of California. So California has had expanded background checks for 20 years or so. And Dr. Winnemute out of UC Davis, who heads up the UC Gun Violence Research Center, he did a study on expanded background checks as well as the expansion to certain misdemeanor crimes that are prohibitors in California. And he couldn't show that this had any significant impact on reducing homicides or reducing suicides, right? So there's some lack of proof there. But the problem is we already have existing laws on the books that actually goes after the bad guys. So if you're a prohibited person and you have possession of a firearm, it's a felony. But if you look at the way expanded background checks work, the penalties, the criminal penalties, are not on the person receiving the firearm. It's on the person that is transferring the firearm, right? So if you're a bad guy, if you go and try and buy a gun and someone, on the slim outside chance that a law enforcement officer actually sees that take place, you're not the one that's going to be in trouble under the new statute. You'd be in trouble under the existing statute. And that's actually a much easier proposal for prosecutors to go after because, there's a strict liability element. Are you prohibited? Yes.
Sure.
You have a firearm?
Well, that's
yes.
ridiculous.
Felony.
Yeah.
And so if you look at the way expanded background checks work, it's a misdemeanor crime. So it has a 2-year statute of limitations. And so if you did come across a bad guy who had unlawfully acquired a firearm, which we know that bad guys do not follow the law, as they don't follow the more than 800 gun laws in the state of California, for a prosecutor to actually prove that case, they're going to have to say, okay, Mr. Bad Guy, where did you get this gun from? When did you get it? And there's all these significant elements, all for a misdemeanor crime. And it's actually interesting. If you haven't watched the hearing on this, where testimony was limited to 2 minutes on this significant change in state law, one of the lawmakers questioned one of the proponents from the gun control groups, and he's a former law enforcement officer, and he said, I've spent decades in law enforcement, and I can't see the public safety benefit. Tell me how you think this is actually going to work. And the attorney that was a proponent there, he said, well, what we're trying to do is create a culture of compliance. That was those are his words. And you kind of think, culture of compliance, what are you trying to do? The idea that you're going to get good guys to comply with this law, because at the end of the day, gun owners, whether we agree or disagree with the law, we're going to go out of our ways to follow laws to ensure that we preserve our rights, while, criminals and those who are intent on doing bad things, they're not going to pay attention to one more law. So that onus is following on the good guys, the law-abiding citizens. And so they're creating that idea of government permission to, let your best friend who has a CCW borrow your firearm to go out to the desert to do some plinking or whatnot. And so it's, let's get together on crime control, not on gun control, right?
Well, I think I understand what you're saying, and that certainly makes sense. I think they could go hand in hand. If you're just joining us, we're speaking with Dan Reid. He is the Western Director of the NRA. He's in town for SHOT Show. JD, go ahead.
Yeah, and I agree with you that criminals, they're going to commit crimes no matter what. I have a question about the financial situation of the NRA. There seems to be a common misconception that the NRA is just bringing in tons and tons of money, but it's actually been running at a deficit for quite some time. For example, in 2018, the revenue was $412 million, and the expenses were $423 million. Why is there this giant misconception that the NRA is just making so much money when it actually isn't?
Well, I think the misconception out there is that people say that the NRA represents the gun makers, right? And we don't.
Right.
We have 5 million members. We are a membership organization, and there is actually a group that does represent the industry who's in town this week. And I think we at least need to highlight National Shooting Sports Foundation. There's 65,000 people in town this week for the SHOT Show, which is an industry trade show. There's nothing for sale here. It's all industry. So people are out here. I believe there's 113 countries that are represented. There's a lot of federal agencies, ATF's here, FBI's here. We have a lot of members of our military, law enforcement, as well as all the big brands. And there's a significant economic impact here in the state of Nevada. I believe there's $100 million in direct economic impact from this show for this week here in Las Vegas. Mm-hmm. And they cover the full gamut. ATF's here to answer questions on regulations. FBI's here. NICS, which is the federal background check system, they're here. There's a ton of compliance areas. There's some really good programs highlighting safety programs and this, that, and the other thing. So it's a phenomenal show. It's a good gathering of professionals throughout the industry to come and see the newest products, some old classics, et cetera, and then have conversations on things.
Sure. Again, Dan Reid joining us, Western Director of the NRA. Dan, we're almost running out of time here, but I want to ask you this question because when we started this conversation, I said, what do you think is the biggest misconception, that Democrats have? So I'm going to go opposite end now, and I'm going to tell you what I think is the biggest misconception of some NRA members and people on the right, and you could tell me whether you disagree or not. I hear a lot of people on the right saying that Democrats are gun grabbers, yet I can't find one politician in office that wants to take everybody's guns away. What they talk about is certain types of weapons, certain types of assault weapons, the types of weapons that were used in the Route 98 festival here in Las Vegas that killed 58 people. 58 people died. The types of guns that were used at Walmart in the El Paso mass shooting, the types of guns that are being used in these types of Route 91. I'm sorry, did I say 98? I apologize. That to me, that is the biggest misconception of people on the right. I've been called a gun grabber before on the air just because I want innocent lives saved. I want every person to be able to defend themselves if they're not a felon and they're not mentally nuts. But at the same time, Democrats are talking about just specific types of guns, weapons of war. Do you think it's fair to say that? Yeah, many people on the right, they call Democrats gun grabbers, where I think the majority of them, especially those in office, are not.
Well, I think that it's unfair to put anyone in a big category, right?
Yep.
There are people out there, and there are elected officials that are okay with taking firearms, right? There was a bill in Virginia just last week that actually got pulled that would take away lawfully possessed firearms that were lawful today with no grandfather clause, no nothing, and take them. And they're just because there's other proposals that are either limiting or taking away that. And we've seen that, again, going back to California, we've had 4 assault weapon bans in the state of California going all the way back to the 80s and having different iterations over the course of time all the way to 2016. And some of the legislation may not directly say, hey, we're going to take your gun, but there's the impact of that. So, for example, in California, we have a handgun roster. There has not been a new model semi-automatic pistol available for sale through retailer since 2012. So if you look at handguns that are on the roster in California, no new ones have been added since 2012. So for example, a Glock. I don't know how familiar you are with Glocks, but the most current Glock you can buy in the state of California is a Generation 3 Glock, and they're all the way on Generation X now, right? Mm-hmm. And that's because of requirements in technology that are just unfeasible. They're not possible. And so, in effect, that has caused this market to shrink, and there is a ban there. We've seen bans on different centerfire semi-automatic rifles, modern sporting rifles, et cetera.
Sure, and I understand.
And so,
yeah, I understand. I'm sorry to interject because we're up against a hard break here, Dan. But
I understand.
I totally understand where you're coming from, where there are Democrats out there that are trying to ban specific weapons. I guess the point I'm trying to make is there are some people on the right that say that they want to ban every single one of your weapons. But listen, Dan, I appreciate you coming on the show, and I appreciate you making your case. You do it eloquently, and I do appreciate that. And I think this is an important conversation that we all need to have respectfully to one another, even if we disagree. And like I said, I really do appreciate you coming on our show, stating your case. Thank you so much. And we would love to have you on the show again, perhaps down the road, because we really do appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
I appreciate you having me on, and I'd love to come back on. Thank you so much.
Appreciate that.
Thanks
Thank you
a
so
lot,
much.
Dan.
That is Dan Reid, the Western Director of the NRA. Unfortunately, I'm up against a hard break. I could have continued to have that conversation with him for a long time, but we appreciate Dan taking some time to join us. We really do. Your thoughts on that? Give us a call, 702-257-5396. Again, that number, if you want to be a part of the conversation, 257-5396. Be back right after this.